My MIL attacked me at 8 months pregnant because we're having another girl. No girl has been born to the men in my husband's family in over a century. It's their pride, their bloodline, can't make females. Wedding night, my mother-in-law grabbed me. Now make us our son, don't let us down. We had a daughter. MIL made comments when my husband wasn't around. Wonder where she got that nose. Not from our side. I kept quiet. She was old, sick. Why ruin their relationship? Second pregnancy, another girl. When we announced it, Mill started sobbing. Not ours. Those girls are not ours. She's a cheater. She turned to me. I let the first one slide, but I will not allow it again. My husband exploded. Told her she'd never see us again. As we left, he yelled, I love that little girl more than I ever loved you. 3 months no contact. At 8 months pregnant, we gave her one chance to apologize. I want paternity tests first, she said at dinner. I stood to leave. She grabbed my shirt. You're not running from this, cheater. She slapped me across the face. My husband jumped between us. As we headed for the door, she threw a snow globe at my head. It connected. I fell, blood running down my neck, holding my belly. She tried to kick me while I was down. My husband pushed her back, got me out. 6 stitches. 4 days monitoring. Baby was fine. Police came. MIL had broken fingers from being pushed, wanted my husband arrested. When forced to tell the truth, FIL admitted what happened. She got arrested. Now FIL's begging. Drop the charges. She's elderly. She assaulted my pregnant wife, my husband said. She's lucky it's only assault charges. We're getting paternity tests. Not because we need them, to mail to her in jail. Here's your proof. You'll never meet your granddaughters. Then my husband's cousin called with the real story. There's something you need to know. My grandmother told me before she died. What? The no girls thing is a lie. Your husband's great-aunt had a daughter in 1917. Gave her up for adoption to hide an unwed pregnancy. The family invented the no girls myth to avoid questions. You're kidding. There's more. In 1953, another relative had twin girls. The family sent them away, claimed they died. That's insane. Your MIL knows. She's always known. She called me from jail, said she's not the first to handle daughters properly. Handle? Check your mail. A package had arrived. No return address. Inside, 2 tiny hospital bracelets from 1953. Names scratched out. A note in Miles' handwriting. Some family traditions are worth preserving. My husband went pale. These are baby hospital bracelets. From the twins who died, I whispered. His phone rang. FIL. Son, your mother made bail. What? How? My brother put up the money. Listen, she's not well. She keeps talking about fixing things the old way. I don't know what that means, but the line went dead. Our doorbell rang. Through the peephole, MIL stood there with 2 men I didn't recognize. Call 911, my husband whispered. I dialed. Mael called through the door. We're family. We just want to talk about the baby. Mom, go away. The police are coming. The police can't stop family traditions, son. We've been handling daughters for over a century. Your wife will understand soon. The 2 men started working on our lock. They're breaking in, I whispered to dispatch. That adoption story was the nice version, Emil called out. Want to know what really happened to the twin girls? Their mother learned to keep quiet after. The lock clicked open. My husband grabbed a baseball bat. Get to the bedroom. Lock the door. We don't want to hurt anyone, Mill said, stepping inside. We just need to ensure this baby doesn't survive. For the family legacy. I ran, 8 months pregnant, up the stairs. Heard my husband shouting, fighting. Locked myself in our room. Called 911 again. They're in the house. She said she's going to kill my baby. Please hurry. Through the door, Miles' voice. Every woman who brought daughters into this family learned their place. Dead or disappeared. Your turn to choose. Sirens in the distance. Her voice got closer. Police won't help. We have family in the department. How do you think I made bail so fast? The doorknob turned. I grabbed my phone to record, hands shaking. Come out, dear. Let's handle this like the family always has. The door started opening. The door crashed open and MIL lunged straight at me with her hands reaching for my stomach. My husband appeared behind her and grabbed her shoulders, yanking her backward with enough force that she stumbled into the hallway. Wallace and Chester were suddenly there too, grabbing my husband's arms and trying to pull him away from her. Mill was screaming something about me ruining everything the family built. Her face twisted up in a way I'd never seen before, like she wasn't even the same person anymore. My husband twisted free from Wallace and shoved him back against the wall. Chester tried to grab my husband from behind, but got an elbow to the ribs that made him double over. Mile kept trying to get past my husband to reach me, clawing at his arms and face. The police sirens were so loud now they had to be right outside our house. I could hear officers shouting commands from downstairs, telling everyone to get on the ground. Mile froze in the middle of trying to lunge at me again. Her whole face changed in like 2 seconds, going from that crazy rage to something cold and smart-looking, like she just remembered something important. She looked at my phone in my hand, still recording everything, and I saw her realize what that meant. She'd been caught saying she wanted to kill my baby, Caught trying to break into our house. Caught with witnesses and proof. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs, and suddenly 4 police officers were there with their guns drawn, yelling at everyone to get their hands up. Wallace and Chester got shoved hard against the bedroom wall and handcuffed, so fast I barely saw it happen. Mael started crying immediately, these big loud sobs, and pointed at my husband while telling the officers that he attacked her first. She kept saying he'd always been mean to her, always been violent, that she was just trying to check on me because she was worried. My husband's face went white with anger, but he didn't say anything, just stood there with his hands up while an officer patted him down. One of the officers stayed with me, asking if I was hurt, if the baby was okay, while the others dealt with the 3 people who'd broken into our house. Another woman arrived a few minutes later, moving fast up the stairs and flashing a badge at the officers. She came straight to me and held out her hand for my phone. "Detective Violet Holcomb," she said, and I needed to give her my phone right now to protect the recording as evidence. I handed it over with shaking hands. She pulled out earbuds and listened to the audio right there in the bedroom, her face getting harder and harder as she heard Mael's voice saying she needed to make sure the baby didn't survive. When the recording finished, Violet looked at the officers and told them to read Mil her rights for attempted murder and conspiracy. Mil started screaming that it was all lies, that I'd made it up somehow. But Violet just stared at her until the officers dragged her out of the room. The EMTs showed up next and wanted to check me over right there in the bedroom because I was shaking too hard to walk down the stairs safely. One of them put his hand on my belly and asked me to tell him when I felt the baby move. It only took a few seconds before I felt her kick against his palm. He smiled and said that was a good, strong kick. Exactly what he wanted to feel. They checked my blood pressure and said it was high, but not dangerous high, just stressed high, which made sense given everything that just happened. The other EMT said they still wanted to take me to the hospital for real monitoring, though, because I was 8 months pregnant, and I'd just been through a physical struggle, and they weren't taking any chances. My husband climbed into the ambulance with me, sitting on the little bench seat and holding my hand so tight it almost hurt. His knuckles were already turning purple and swelling up from fighting off Wallace and Chester. He kept saying he was sorry, that he should have protected me better, that he should have never let them get that close to me. I told him he literally fought 3 people at the same time to keep them away from me and our baby, and that was more than most people would ever do. He started crying then, just quiet tears running down his face while the ambulance drove us to the hospital. At the hospital, they took me straight back to a room and a doctor came in almost right away. Dr. Scarlett Luna introduced herself and said she was going to do an ultrasound to make absolutely sure the baby was okay after all the stress and fighting. She squeezed cold gel on my belly and moved the wand around, and within seconds our daughter's heartbeat filled the room, strong and steady. Scarlett pointed at the screen and showed us the baby moving around, stretching her little arms and legs like nothing had even happened. She explained that babies are protected really well inside the mother's body, surrounded by fluid and muscle and everything else, so even when the mother goes through something scary, the baby is usually just fine. But she wanted me on bed rest for 48 hours anyway, just to be extra careful, especially since I'd already had one head injury a few weeks ago. Detective Holcomb showed up about an hour later with a man she introduced as her partner Edwin. They pulled chairs up next to my hospital bed and asked us to tell them everything that happened, starting from when FIL called to say MIL had made bail. My husband did most of the talking, explaining about the package with the hospital bracelets, the phone call warning us that Mael was talking about fixing things the old way, the doorbell ringing with Mill and 2 strange men outside. I added the parts about being upstairs, hearing the lock break, calling 911 again, recording Mill's threats through the door. Violet wrote everything down in a little notebook, stopping us sometimes to ask specific questions about exact words or times. When we finished, she explained that MIL, Wallace, and Chester were all being held without bail this time. The charges were serious, she said. Home invasion, attempted assault, conspiracy to commit murder, and terroristic threats. Edwin leaned forward and said they were also looking into MIL's claim about having family in the police department who helped her make bail so fast. He said if there was corruption involved, internal affairs would handle that part separately. Right now, their main job was building a case so strong against all 3 of them that no judge would ever let them out again. Violet added that they had my recording. They had the forced entry evidence. They had multiple officer witnesses who heard MIL's statements. And they had Wallace and Chester who would probably flip on MIL to save themselves. It was as solid a case as she'd ever worked, she said. And we should try to rest and focus on the baby while they handled the legal stuff. After the detectives left, a hospital security guard came to my room and said he'd been assigned to stay outside my door. Violet had called down to warn them that FIL was calling the main desk over and over, trying to find out what room I was in, and the hospital wasn't taking any chances with more family members showing up. My husband pulled out his phone and called his cousin back, the one who'd told us about the family history and the murdered daughters. He asked if the cousin could come to the hospital because we needed to know everything, every detail about what really happened to all those baby girls over the last 100 years. The cousin showed up around 7 that evening carrying a thick manila folder that looked like it had been stuffed with papers for years. He pulled a chair up to my hospital bed and set the folder on the rolling table, his hands shaking a little as he opened it. He explained that his grandmother told him everything right before she died about 3 years ago, made him promise that if anyone in the family ever tried to hurt another daughter, he had to stop it no matter what. She spent her last days crying about the babies, he said, about how she knew what happened and never spoke up because she was too scared of the family. He started collecting documents after that, searching through old family records and courthouse files and newspaper archives, building evidence of what really happened over the last 100 years. My husband leaned forward and asked what was in the folder. The cousin pulled out the first document, a birth certificate from 1953 for twin girls born to my husband's great-aunt. Their names were listed as Mary and Margaret, born on June 14th at the county hospital, both listed as healthy full-term babies. He set that aside and pulled out a death certificate dated just 3 days later, claiming both babies died of sudden illness, signed by a family doctor who lost his license 2 years after that for falsifying medical records. Then came newspaper clippings about the 1917 adoption, except the articles told a different story than the family version. The birth mother had tried to keep her baby girl, fought the adoption in court, claimed her family was forcing her to give up a healthy child for no medical reason. The judge ruled against her because her father and brothers all testified she was unstable and unfit, and the baby disappeared into the adoption system with all records sealed. My husband picked up one of the clippings and read it 3 times, his face getting paler each time. The cousin kept pulling out more papers, letters written between family members in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. One letter from my husband's great-grandmother talked about how to handle the girl problem, suggesting that quick action after birth was easiest because nobody asked too many questions about newborn deaths back then. Another letter discussed sending older girls away to homes for troubled women where they could be kept quiet and controlled. A third letter actually used the word disposal when talking about a 6-month-old baby girl born in 1931. My husband started crying while reading through the letters, just silent tears running down his face and dripping onto the hospital blanket. He looked up at his cousin and asked how many daughters did the family kill or disappear over the years. The cousin said he found evidence of at least 12, maybe more, going back to the early 1900s, when record-keeping was less careful and deaths were easier to hide. Violet came back the next morning with Edwin and a woman from the forensics team who photographed every single document in that folder. Violet explained they were opening a formal investigation into possible cold case murders based on the evidence the cousin provided. She said the district attorney, Hank Madden, was taking over the whole case personally because of how serious it was, the pattern of violence against baby girls spanning more than a century. Edwin carefully placed each document into evidence bags after the photographer finished, logging everything with case numbers and chain of custody forms. Violet told us Hank wanted to meet with us as soon as I was discharged from the hospital to go over the legal strategy. She said between my recording of MIL threatening to kill the baby, the forced entry evidence, the officer witness statements, and now this historical pattern, they had enough to pursue attempted murder charges, and possibly even conspiracy to commit murder going back generations. My husband asked if the family members who killed those other babies could be charged too. Violet explained that most of them were dead now, but they could file charges anyway for the historical record, make sure the truth was officially documented even if nobody could be prosecuted. A hospital social worker showed up around lunchtime to talk about safety planning for after my discharge. She sat down with a clipboard full of forms and explained that given what happened, given MIL's clear willingness to use violence and her knowledge of our home address, we needed to think seriously about temporary relocation. She asked if we had family or friends in other areas who could take us in for a while, somewhere MIL and her relatives wouldn't know to look. My husband mentioned his cousin, and the social worker nodded and said that sounded like a good option, as long as it was far enough away, and the address was kept completely private. She went through a whole checklist of safety measures, things like changing our phone numbers, not posting anything on social media, varying our routes if we had to go anywhere, keeping the hospital and police informed of our location at all times. My husband's phone rang while the social worker was still there. His boss was calling to check on us after hearing about what happened through the police report. My husband stepped into the hallway to take the call and came back 15 minutes later with tears in his eyes again. He told me his employer was giving him immediate remote work arrangements for as long as he needed. No questions asked about timeline or when he might return to the office. His boss said the company would pay for a complete security system installation at whatever address we ended up staying at. Cameras and motion sensors and professional monitoring. Everything. My husband sat down on the edge of my hospital bed and cried into his hands because he said he felt like his whole life was falling apart, but at least some people were being kind when they didn't have to be. The social worker handed him some tissues and added the security system information to her notes about our safety plan. We got discharged exactly 48 hours after arriving, with a whole packet of instructions about bed rest and stress reduction and warning signs to watch for with the pregnancy. Scarlett came by one more time before we left to do a final check on the baby. She did another ultrasound and said everything still looked perfect, strong heartbeat and good movement, and the baby was measuring right on track for 36 weeks. She told me to take it easy and avoid any physical stress or emotional upset as much as possible, which felt almost funny given everything that was happening. My husband's cousin met us at the hospital entrance with his car. He had already arranged everything, cleared out their guest room and made up the bed and told his wife we were coming to stay for a while. He lived 2 towns away in a quiet neighborhood where MIL had never been and wouldn't know how to find. He helped me into the back seat and my husband loaded our overnight bags that someone had brought from our house. The cousin's house was small but felt safe the second we walked in. His wife met us at the door and gave me a careful hug, telling me she was so sorry about everything and we could stay as long as we needed. She had set up the guest room with extra pillows and a little table next to the bed with water and snacks, and my phone charger already plugged in. She showed us the baby monitor system she installed, 1 unit in our room and 1 in their bedroom, so they could hear if I needed help during the night while my husband was dealing with police calls and lawyer meetings. My husband thanked her about 5 times, and she just waved him off and said, "Family helps family," even if his blood family turned out to be monsters. I spent most of that first day in bed resting like the doctor ordered while my husband dealt with phone calls in the living room. I could hear his voice through the door, talking to Violet and Edwin and lawyers and his work. The same conversations over and over about what happened and what came next. Detective Edwin called late that afternoon with news about the corrupt officer. My husband came into the bedroom to tell me they had identified who expedited MIL's bail, and he was suspended pending a full investigation by Internal Affairs. Edwin said it turned out the officer was actually FIL's nephew, not some random family connection in the department, which explained how MIL knew exactly who to contact for help. The suspension was immediate, and the investigation was looking into whether he had helped cover up other family crimes over the years. My husband said Edwin sounded confident they would find more corruption because a guy willing to help his aunt make bail after assaulting a pregnant woman probably wasn't too careful about following rules in general. The next morning, Hank Madden drove out to the cousin's house to meet with us in person. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with a serious face and a briefcase full of documents. He sat down at the kitchen table with us and laid out the legal strategy in clear terms. He was bringing attempted murder charges against MIL, conspiracy charges against Wallace and Chester for helping her break into our house, and he was pursuing the maximum possible sentences for all 3. He explained that the pregnancy made it attempted murder of an unborn child, which carried serious penalties, and the historical pattern of violence against daughters would be presented as evidence of premeditation and motive. Hank said he wanted us to understand this would be a long process, probably several months before trial, and we needed to be prepared for MIL's lawyers to try every possible defense. My husband asked what kind of defenses they might use. Hank said they would probably claim mental illness or diminished capacity due to age, try to paint MIL as a confused old woman who didn't understand what she was doing. But he had my recording where Mel sounded completely clear and purposeful when she threatened to kill the baby, plus the evidence of planning and recruiting help, which would destroy any claim that she wasn't in her right mind. He pulled out a legal pad and walked us through the timeline, preliminary hearings and discovery and motions and jury selection, all the steps between now and an actual trial. Hank explained that my recording was the most important piece of evidence they had. Mael explicitly stated her intent to kill the baby on that recording. Use the exact words, "ensure this baby doesn't survive." She also referenced the family's history of handling daughters, which connected her current actions to the historical pattern of murders. Combined with the physical evidence of the forced entry, the tool marks on our lock, the officer testimony about what they heard. When they arrived and the witness statements from Wallace and Chester, who would probably flip on her to save themselves, Hank said he was confident about getting a conviction. But he wanted us ready for a hard fight because MIL's family had money and would hire expensive lawyers who would drag out every possible procedural challenge. 2 days later, Hank called with news that made my husband's face go hard. FIL's lawyer had reached out offering a deal: immunity from prosecution in exchange for testimony against MIL. The lawyer claimed FIL was ready to tell everything about what happened to the 1953 twins and other daughters throughout the family history. My husband paced the cousin's living room while Hank explained the offer over speakerphone. FIL would provide details about burial locations, names of family members involved in the murders, and documentation he'd kept hidden for decades. Hank said the prosecutors were interested because FIL's information could help them build cases on multiple cold case murders, but he wanted us to understand this was probably self-preservation rather than genuine guilt or remorse. My husband stopped pacing and stared at the wall for a long moment before responding that he wouldn't speak directly to his father under any circumstances, but the prosecutors could use whatever testimony FIL provided if it helped put Mael away for life. Hank said that was exactly the arrangement he'd recommend, and he'd make sure all communication went through legal channels, so my husband never had to face his father again. After the call ended, my husband sat down next to me on the couch and put his head in his hands. I didn't say anything, just put my hand on his back while he processed what his father's cooperation really meant, that FIL had known about murdered babies his entire adult life and stayed silent until it benefited him legally. The next morning, my husband made arrangements to deal with our actual house since I couldn't go back there yet. He called a locksmith and scheduled a complete rekey of every door and window lock, then contacted a security company about installing cameras and motion sensors throughout the property. A cleaning service was hired to go through the house and clean up the damage from the break-in, the broken door frame and scattered belongings, and the general mess left behind by the police investigation. My husband handled all of this over the phone from the cousin's kitchen while I stayed in bed like the doctor ordered. Between calls, he came in to tell me he thought we should sell the house after the baby was born. I agreed immediately because I couldn't imagine ever feeling safe there again, not after MIL had forced her way inside with the explicit intent to kill our child. The house was supposed to be where we built our family, where our daughters would grow up, but now it just felt like a crime scene. My husband said he'd talk to a realtor once things settled down, but for now the security upgrades were necessary to protect the property and our belongings, even if we weren't living there. 3 days after the home invasion, I woke up at the cousin's house with cramping that felt different from the usual pregnancy discomfort. I tried to ignore it and went back to sleep, but an hour later the cramping turned into actual contractions. My husband was already awake and noticed me breathing through the pain. He timed the contractions for 20 minutes, and when they stayed consistent at 7 minutes apart, he called Dr. Luna's emergency line. She told us to come to the hospital immediately because at 36 weeks the baby was early enough to need monitoring, but developed enough to be healthy if labor continued. The drive to the hospital felt surreal. My husband gripping the steering wheel too tight while I focused on breathing and trying not to panic about having the baby 4 weeks ahead of schedule. Dr. Luna met us in the labor and delivery unit and examined me right away. She explained this was likely stress-induced labor, that my body had been through so much trauma in the past week that it triggered early delivery, but she assured us the baby was developed enough to handle being born now. They hooked me up to monitors that showed the baby's heartbeat strong and steady, even as my contractions got closer together. Dr. Luna said she'd monitor everything carefully and intervene if necessary, but for now it looked like we were having a baby today whether we were ready or not. Labor progressed faster than expected, probably because this was my second delivery and my body knew what to do. 6 hours after we arrived at the hospital, our daughter was born weighing 6 pounds 2 ounces, perfectly healthy despite being 4 weeks early. The nurses placed her on my chest and she let out a strong cry that made my husband start sobbing. He stood next to the bed with tears streaming down his face, reaching out to touch her tiny hand. When the nurses took her to clean her up and check her vital signs, my husband followed them across the room like he couldn't bear to let her out of his sight. After they confirmed she was completely healthy, just a little small, they brought her back wrapped in a hospital blanket. My husband held her for the first time and whispered that she was wanted and loved and would never have to hide who she was. He told her she was perfect exactly as she was, that being a girl made her special and important, not something shameful that needed to be erased. I watched him cradle our daughter and promise her a life free from the hatred and violence that had defined his family for generations. Later that day, after I'd rested and the baby had nursed successfully, we talked about names. My husband said he wanted to name her after his grandmother, the woman who told the cousin the truth on her deathbed. He explained that his grandmother had tried to stop the family pattern, even though it took her entire life to find the courage, and she deserved to be honored for breaking the silence. I loved the idea of giving our daughter a name connected to the one person in his family who'd done the right thing. We filled out the birth certificate paperwork with her name written clearly, a tribute to the woman who'd helped save our lives by telling the truth before she died. The hospital assigned extra security to our room because Hank had warned them about potential threats. He'd learned that FIL was making statements about wanting to meet his granddaughter before he died, using his age and health as justification for why we should allow visitation. My husband told the nurses that his father was absolutely not welcome under any circumstances, and if FIL showed up, we'd get a restraining order immediately. The nurses noted it in their system and assured us that no one would get past the security desk without our explicit approval. A guard was stationed outside our door around the clock, which should have felt like overkill, but actually made me feel safer given everything that had happened. On our second day in the hospital, Violet came by with news that actually made us both smile for the first time in days. Wallace and Chester had both agreed to plea deals in exchange for testifying against MIL. They'd provided detailed statements about how MIL recruited them, claiming we were abusing her, and she needed help rescuing her son from a dangerous situation. Wallace told investigators that MIL had approached him at a bar where he worked security, spinning a story about her daughter-in-law holding her son hostage and threatening to hurt the baby. Chester had a similar story, that MIL found him through a mutual acquaintance and convinced him she was a desperate grandmother trying to save her family. Both men now admitted they should have questioned her story more carefully, especially when she started talking about ensuring the baby didn't survive, but they'd believed her initial claims about abuse. Violet explained that their testimony would be crucial because it proved MIL's premeditation and her explicit statements about intending to harm the baby. The plea deals meant Wallace and Chester would serve reduced sentences for home invasion and conspiracy, probably 8 to 10 years each depending on their prior records, but they'd be convicted felons with significant prison time. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. More importantly, their cooperation provided prosecutors with additional evidence showing MIL had planned the attack carefully, recruiting help and lying about her motivations to get people to assist with breaking into our home. Violet said Hank was confident their testimony combined with my recording would make MIL's conviction almost certain, and the historical pattern of violence would push for maximum sentencing. We were discharged from the hospital after 3 days with a healthy baby girl who'd passed all her health checks despite being early. The cousin picked us up and drove us back to his house, where our older daughter was waiting to meet her little sister. She'd stayed with the cousin's wife during the delivery, and they'd prepared her by explaining that the baby came early, but was perfectly fine. Our older daughter approached the car seat carefully, eyes wide with fascination at the tiny baby sleeping inside. She asked 100 questions about when her sister would be big enough to play, whether she could hold her, why she was so small, what her name meant, if she could help feed her. My husband answered each question patiently while carrying the car seat into the house, and I watched our older daughter follow him like she was afraid to let the baby out of her sight. Inside, the cousin's wife had set up a bassinet in our room and stocked it with diapers and supplies. Our older daughter wanted to sit next to the bassinet and watch the baby sleep, so we pulled a chair over and let her stay there while we unpacked the hospital bags. She kept reaching out to touch her sister's hand, whispering that she was going to be the best big sister ever and teach her everything important. Watching them together made me cry, thinking about how close we'd come to losing this, how MIL had tried to prevent this exact moment from happening. But here we were, both daughters healthy and safe, starting a life that had nothing to do with my husband's toxic family and everything to do with the family we were choosing to build together. The next day, a massive gift basket arrived from my husband's employer with a card signed by everyone in his department. The card had messages written all around the edges saying they were thinking of us and supporting us through everything. My husband opened it in the cousin's kitchen and just stared at all the signatures for a long time before he started crying. His boss had written a note at the bottom saying they'd set up a meal train to bring us dinner every night for the next month so we wouldn't have to worry about cooking while dealing with a newborn and everything else. I cried too because we'd felt so alone and cut off from normal human kindness for so long. It felt weird that people we barely knew were being nicer to us than my husband's own family had ever been. The cousin's wife helped us set up a calendar to track who was bringing food each night and made sure they all had the correct address since we weren't at our regular house anymore. That afternoon, Hank called with an update that made my stomach drop. FIL's testimony had led investigators to 3 potential burial sites on the family property, where he claimed his mother and grandmother had buried infant daughters over the decades. Forensic teams were getting ready to excavate once they got the proper warrants, and brought in cadaver dogs to confirm the locations. My husband's hands shook while he was on the phone, and he had to sit down at the kitchen table. Hank explained the process would take several weeks because they needed to document everything carefully for potential murder charges, even though the people who did it were already dead. The idea that there might actually be baby bodies buried on his family's land made my husband physically sick. He ran to the bathroom and I heard him throwing up. When he came back, he looked pale and asked Hank if they really thought they'd find anything, or if Phil might be lying. Hank said Phil had given very specific details about locations and methods that suggested he was telling the truth, which made it worse somehow. 2 weeks later, Hank called again. The forensic teams had discovered remains at 2 of the 3 sites. My husband answered the phone and I watched his face go white as Hank explained what they'd found. DNA testing would take months to confirm identities, but the preliminary evidence suggested the remains were consistent with infant females from the 1950s timeframe. That meant FIL had been telling the truth about at least some of the family's crimes. There were actually dead babies buried on the property, babies who'd been killed just for being girls. My husband hung up and sat on the couch staring at nothing for almost an hour. Our older daughter asked him why he looked so sad, and he told her he'd just learned something very bad about his family from a long time ago. She climbed into his lap and hugged him, which made him start crying again. That night he couldn't sleep, and I found him sitting in the nursery watching our baby daughter sleep in her bassinet. He whispered that he couldn't believe his own grandmother and great-grandmother had actually murdered babies, that it wasn't just family stories or exaggerations, but real, actual murders. Around the same time, Neil's lawyer tried to argue that she was mentally unfit to stand trial because of her age and possible dementia. Hank told us about it over the phone and said he wasn't worried. He'd already brought in psychiatric experts who evaluated MIL thoroughly and determined she was completely competent and had been acting with clear premeditation and intent. The evaluation showed she knew exactly what she was doing when she came to our house and tried to hurt me and the baby. Her memory was fine, her reasoning was clear, and she understood right from wrong. She just believed killing daughters was the right thing to do for the family. The mental fitness defense was destroyed before it even really started. Hank said the evaluation actually helped the prosecution because it proved MIL was dangerous in a calculated way, not just confused or sick. A few days after that, we got a letter forwarded from our old address. It was from someone named Margaret who said she was the granddaughter of the 1917 adoption daughter. She'd found us through news coverage of the case and wanted us to know that her grandmother had lived a good life with her adoptive family, but her grandmother had always wondered about her birth family and died never knowing the truth about why she was given up. Margaret included a photo of her grandmother as an old woman, and I stared at it for a long time. She had the same nose as our older daughter, the same smile. My husband looked at the photo and started crying again because it proved his family had been lying about everything for so long. We called Margaret back and arranged to meet her at a coffee shop halfway between our towns. When we walked in with our older daughter, Margaret stood up and gasped. She looked at our daughter and then at the photo she'd brought of her grandmother, and you could see the family resemblance immediately. Same nose, same smile, same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. Margaret started crying and said it was like seeing a ghost of her grandmother as a child. She told us her grandmother had been happy with her adoptive parents, but always felt like something was missing, always wondered why her birth mother gave her up. Now Margaret understood it wasn't a choice. It was the family forcing it to hide an unwed pregnancy and maintain their lies about not having daughters. Meeting her felt strange and sad and good all at the same time. She looked remarkably like our older daughter, which proved she was definitely part of the family bloodline despite Mill's claims that daughters couldn't come from their side. The genetics didn't lie even if the family did. Margaret asked if she could stay in touch with us and meet both our daughters as they grew up, and we said yes because she was the only decent connection to my husband's family history that existed. 2 weeks after our baby was born, the preliminary hearing happened at the courthouse. My husband went while I stayed home with both girls. He came back 3 hours later looking shaken and pale. He sat down at the kitchen table and told me Phil had testified in detail about how his mother and grandmother killed infant daughters by suffocation and buried them on the family land. Phil described the methods they used, the locations of the graves, and the years when it happened. He testified that he'd known about it his whole life because his mother told him when he was a teenager, explaining it was family tradition to handle daughters this way. My husband said listening to his father describe baby murders in a calm, matter-of-fact voice was the most horrible thing he'd ever experienced. Phil's testimony revealed that the whole no girls mythology was deliberately created in the 1920s to explain why daughters kept disappearing from the family. The family elders decided it was better to claim genetic impossibility than risk questions about missing babies. They spread the story at family gatherings, told it to neighbors and friends, and eventually everyone just accepted it as fact. By the time my husband was born, the mythology was so established that nobody questioned it anymore. It became family pride instead of family shame, this idea that their bloodline was so strong and male that it couldn't produce females. The truth was they'd been producing females all along and killing them. During Phil's testimony, Mill's reaction was caught on the courtroom cameras. She started screaming at Phil that he was betraying everything they built together. She yelled that he was weak and pathetic for telling the truth, that he should have protected the family legacy no matter what. The bailiffs had to remove her from the courtroom while she was still screaming at him. Hank told my husband later that her outburst actually helped the prosecution because it showed her complete lack of remorse and her view of the murders as justified family tradition rather than crimes. After the hearing, the judge denied bail again and ordered Mil to undergo psychiatric evaluation at the state facility. The evaluation took a week and confirmed everything we already knew. She was competent and understood what she'd done, but she genuinely believed killing daughters was necessary to preserve family honor. The psychiatrist's report said she showed no remorse, no understanding that her beliefs were wrong, and posed an extreme danger to any female children in the family. The evaluation concluded she would absolutely try again if given the opportunity, which made her too dangerous to ever release. 2 weeks after the evaluation, we started seeing a therapist who works with families dealing with cult-like thinking and abuse. Her office was small and comfortable with soft chairs and toys in the corner for kids. She explained that Mil grew up hearing this mythology about no girls being born and truly believed daughters brought shame to the family. It didn't excuse what Mil did, but it helped us understand how deep the belief went. The therapist said Mil wasn't crazy in the legal sense. She was brainwashed by generations of family lies and violence. Our older daughter started having bad dreams about a scary grandma, even though she wasn't there when Mil broke into our house. She would wake up crying and asking if the mean lady was coming back. The therapist told us that kids pick up on their parents' stress even when we try to hide it. She suggested family play therapy where our daughter could act out her fears with dolls and toys. We went twice a week, and slowly our daughter started sleeping better. Meanwhile, Hank called with news about a plea deal. The prosecution offered Mil life in prison with a chance at parole after 25 years if she pled guilty to attempted murder and conspiracy. Her lawyer told her to take it because the evidence against her was overwhelming. Mil refused. She told her lawyer she did nothing wrong and demanded a trial because she wanted to prove daughters shouldn't exist in their family. Hank said her refusal actually helped our case because it showed she had zero remorse and still believed killing babies was justified. The trial got scheduled for 3 months away. Hank explained this was faster than normal because the judge understood the urgency with our baby's safety and the historical pattern of violence. Plus, the evidence was so strong that both sides needed less time to prepare than usual. During one of our therapy sessions, my husband and I realized we couldn't keep living in the house where Mil attacked us. Every time I walked past the bedroom where I hid while she tried to break in, I felt sick. We decided to sell and move somewhere his extended family didn't know about. The realtor we found was really understanding when we explained we needed good security and total privacy. She showed us houses in a town 40 minutes away and found a perfect place with a gated entrance and new locks on every door. We made an offer the same day. Moving into the new house felt like starting over completely. My husband and I painted the nursery together in soft yellow and hung pictures of flowers on the walls. He built shelves for both girls' rooms using wood he picked out himself. Every nail he hammered felt like building something good with no connection to his family's awful history. Our older daughter adjusted faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, she made friends with kids who lived on our street. I would watch her play outside laughing and running around, and it made me believe we could actually move past the trauma. She was just a normal kid again, instead of a scared one. The genealogist we hired finished her research 6 weeks after we moved. She came to our new house with a thick folder and presented us with a complete family tree going back 100 years. It showed at least 12 daughters born into my husband's family during that time. Only 2 survived to adulthood. One was the girl from 1917 who got adopted out. The other ran away when she was 16 and was never mentioned in family records again. The genealogist had tracked down the runaway girl through census records and old newspaper articles. We reached out to her descendants through a letter explaining who we were and what we'd discovered. Her daughter called us 3 days later. She told us her mother had built a good life far from the family, but refused to ever talk about where she came from. The only thing she ever said was that her birth family were dangerous people who hated women. Now her daughter understood it was literally true. She thanked us for finally exposing what happened and said her mother would have been relieved to know the truth came out. 3 months passed faster than I expected. Our baby was growing and healthy, and our older daughter was thriving in her new school. Then Hank called to say jury selection was starting the next week. He explained he was being careful to screen for jurors who could handle disturbing content about violence against kids. He needed people who would understand that the historical pattern mattered, even though the main charges were about the attempted murder of our baby. He walked us through what to expect, and promised he had built the strongest case possible. The trial was finally beginning, and we were as ready as we would ever be. The trial started on a cold Monday morning in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and cleaning products. My husband and I sat behind Hank at the prosecution table, while Mil sat across the aisle with her lawyer, staring straight ahead like she was at church instead of facing attempted murder charges. The jury filed in and took their seats. 12 people who would decide if Mil went to prison for trying to kill our baby. Hank stood up for opening statements and walked to the jury box with my phone in his hand. He pressed play, and Mil's voice filled the courtroom, clear and cold through the speakers. Every word she said that night came through perfectly. Her threat to kill the baby, her statements about family tradition, her claim that she was handling things the way the family always had. Several jurors looked shocked, and one older woman actually put her hand over her mouth. Hank let the recording finish before he spoke. He explained that this wasn't just about one night of violence. It was about a century of daughters being murdered and hidden to protect a family myth. He told them they would hear testimony about infant remains found buried on family property, about historical documents proving the pattern, about 3 people breaking into our home with the specific goal of ending my pregnancy. Mil's lawyer objected twice during the opening, but the judge overruled both times because Hank was just outlining what the evidence would show. The next day, I took the stand and my hands shook, so bad I had to grip the armrests to keep them still. Hank asked me to describe the comments Mil made during my first pregnancy, and I told the jury about her questioning my daughter's nose, her hints that the baby wasn't really from their family. Then he asked about the second pregnancy, and I walked them through Mil's breakdown when we announced another girl, her accusations of cheating, the escalating threats. I described the restaurant assault in detail, the slap across my face, the snow globe hitting my head, Mil trying to kick me while I was on the ground protecting my belly. Several jurors were taking notes, and I could see their faces getting more serious as I talked. Then Hank asked about the home invasion, and I explained how terrified I felt locked in that bedroom, 8 months pregnant, listening to Mil threaten to kill my baby while she tried to break down the door. The whole time I testified, Mil stared at me with this look of pure disgust on her face, like I was something dirty she'd stepped in. The jury noticed. I saw 3 of them glance at her, and then look away quickly, and one man actually frowned at her reaction. When the defense lawyer cross-examined me, he tried to suggest I was exaggerating because I was upset, but Hank objected and reminded everyone that I had recordings and medical records proving everything I said. My husband testified right after lunch, and he looked exhausted before he even started talking. Hank asked him to explain what he was taught growing up about daughters in his family, and my husband's voice cracked when he described believing the no girls thing was genetic fact, something he'd heard his whole life from everyone in the family. He told the jury about his pride when our first daughter was born, how he thought we'd beaten some kind of genetic odds, and then the confusion when his mother started making those comments. When Hank asked about discovering the truth, my husband broke down describing the moment he realized his family had been murdering baby girls for generations and his mother knew about it the entire time. He talked about the horror of learning that daughters weren't impossible, they were just killed, and how that knowledge changed everything he thought he knew about his family. Mil's lawyer tried to paint my husband as biased and emotional, But it backfired because the jury could see he was genuinely devastated by what his family had done. The cousin came next with his folder of documents, and he was calmer than I expected, like he'd been preparing for this moment since his grandmother died. He described her deathbed confession in detail, how she cried while telling him about the twin girls, and begged him to stop it if it ever happened again. Hank had him walk through each document: the birth certificates that proved the twins existed, the newspaper clippings about adoptions that were actually forced separations, the letters between family members discussing how to handle the girl problem. When the cousin read parts of those letters out loud, 2 jurors were visibly crying, and one woman looked like she might be sick. The letters were specific about methods and burial locations, written in casual language like the writers were discussing gardening instead of infanticide. Miles' lawyer barely cross-examined the cousin because there wasn't much he could challenge when the documents were right there in black and white. FIL took the stand after the cousin, and he looked 20 years older than the last time I'd seen him. Hank asked him what his mother told him about the family tradition, and FIL described conversations where she explained that daughters brought shame to the family, that they had to be handled quietly to preserve the bloodline mythology. He gave specific details about burial locations on the family property, and described methods his mother said were used, information he couldn't have known unless someone told him directly. Miles' lawyer attacked him hard during cross-examination, pointing out that he was testifying to save himself from harsher charges, suggesting he was making things up to get a better deal. But Hank came back on redirect and had FIL describe exact locations where remains were later found, proving he was telling the truth because the police hadn't released those details publicly. Wallace testified that MIL approached him at a bar and told him her daughter-in-law was abusing her son and keeping her away from her family. He said she cried and begged for help, claimed she just wanted to talk to us, but we'd gotten a restraining order that wasn't real. She promised him money and insisted they were doing the right thing by helping her get into our house. Chester's testimony was almost identical, describing how MIL recruited him through Wallace and convinced them both that we were the bad guys. Both men admitted she told them specifically that she needed to handle the baby before it was born, though they claimed they didn't understand she meant killing it until they were already at our house. The jury didn't look sympathetic to either of them. The forensic anthropologist brought photographs and reports about the infant remains found on the family property. She explained that DNA testing confirmed the remains were related to my husband's family line and that the bones were consistent with female infants who died in the 1950s timeframe. She described the burial methods and locations, which matched exactly what FIL had described in his testimony. Miles' lawyer tried to suggest the remains could be from natural deaths, but the anthropologist shut that down by explaining that the burial locations and methods were consistent with concealment, not normal infant burial practices from that era. The defense put on almost no case, just MIL's lawyer standing up and arguing for 20 minutes that she was a confused old woman who loved her family and made bad choices trying to protect them. He claimed she was scared and irrational, that she didn't really mean the threats on the recording, that everything got blown out of proportion. The jury looked completely unconvinced, especially after sitting through days of testimony and evidence showing MIL was coherent and purposeful throughout everything. Hank's closing argument took 3 hours, and he walked the jury through every single piece of evidence showing Miel planned this, intended to kill our baby, and had zero remorse about any of it. He played the recording again and pointed out how clear and rational MIL sounded when she threatened to kill my baby for the family legacy. He reminded them about the historical documents, the buried remains, FIL's testimony about family tradition. He argued that attempted murder charges existed specifically for people like MIL, someone who tried to kill a baby and would absolutely try again if given any chance. The defense's closing argument lasted maybe 30 minutes, and mostly repeated the confused elderly woman angle that nobody was buying. The jury went out to deliberate at 2 in the afternoon. We waited in a victim services room down the hall, me and my husband and our baby girl who had no idea how close she'd come to never being born. 4 hours later, the bailiff came and said the jury had reached a verdict. We walked back into the courtroom and I felt sick with nerves even though Hank said 4 hours was a good sign. The jury foreman stood up and read guilty on every single count: attempted murder, conspiracy, home invasion, terroristic threats, assault. Miel didn't react at all, just sat there staring at nothing while the judge polled each juror individually to confirm their votes. My husband grabbed my hand and squeezed it so hard it hurt, but I didn't care because it was finally over. Sentencing happened 2 weeks after the verdict, and we were back in the same courtroom with the same judge. Mill sat at the defense table looking smaller somehow, like the guilty verdicts had physically shrunk her. The judge reviewed the case file for what felt like forever, before he finally looked up and started speaking. He said the historical pattern of violence against infant daughters in the family, combined with MIL's complete lack of remorse throughout the entire trial, made her too dangerous to ever be released back into society. Life in prison without possibility of parole for 40 years, which at her age meant she would die behind bars. Mill didn't react at all when he said it, just kept staring straight ahead like she was somewhere else entirely. My husband grabbed my hand under the table and I felt his whole body relax next to mine. Wallace got sentenced next and received 8 years for home invasion and conspiracy. The judge said he'd be eligible for parole after serving 2/3 of the sentence if he demonstrated genuine rehabilitation, which meant just over 5 years if he behaved. Chester got 10 years because he had a prior criminal record for assault. Same parole eligibility after 2/3. Both men looked relieved compared to what MIL got, and Wallace actually apologized to us when the judge asked if he had anything to say. Chester just nodded and said he made a terrible mistake trusting MIL. Hank told us afterward that FIL was charged as an accessory after the fact for helping MIL make bail when he knew she intended to harm us. FIL took a plea deal the following week and got 5 years probation plus mandatory counseling. Part of his deal required him to testify in any future cases related to the historical murders, which Hank said was important for the cold case investigation. That investigation wrapped up about a month later, with the district attorney filing murder charges, posthumously against MIL's mother-in-law and grandmother-in-law for the deaths of at least 6 infant daughters. Hank explained that even though they were dead and couldn't be prosecuted, the official charges provided closure and created a historical record of what really happened to those babies. The forensic team had found enough evidence at the burial sites to confirm the deaths weren't natural or accidental. We decided to hold a memorial service for all the lost daughters once the investigation concluded. It was small, just us and the cousin and his wife, plus the granddaughter of the 1917 adoption and some relatives from the runaway daughter's family. We planted a flowering cherry tree in our backyard and installed a bronze plaque at its base listing every daughter's name we'd been able to identify through the genealogy research and historical records. 12 names total spanning over a century of family history. The 1917 descendant brought flowers and photos of her grandmother, who had lived a good life, but never knew why she'd been given away as a baby. The runaway daughter's son talked about how his mother refused to ever speak about her birth family, except to warn him that some bloodlines carried darkness. Standing there with all those people who shared my daughter's DNA felt surreal, like we were reclaiming something that had been stolen and buried for generations. 6 months after the trial ended, our older daughter asked why we didn't see Grandma anymore. She was 4.5 by then, and starting to notice that other kids had grandparents who visited or sent birthday cards. We sat down with her in the living room and explained in the simplest terms we could manage that Grandma had made very bad choices that hurt people. We told her that sometimes when adults make dangerous choices, they have to go away to a place where they can't hurt anyone else. And that's what happened to Grandma. She asked if Grandma would ever come back, and my husband told her no. Grandma would be staying in that place for the rest of her life because the choices she made were so serious. Our daughter seemed to accept this and went back to playing with her toys, though she brought it up occasionally over the next few weeks before finally stopping. Our younger daughter turned 8 months old around the same time and was thriving in every way. She hit all her developmental milestones early, rolling over and sitting up and starting to crawl like she was in a hurry to explore everything. Her personality was already showing through fierce and determined and completely her own. My husband joked constantly that she was proving the family mythology wrong just by existing, being strong and healthy and unmistakably herself. Watching her grow without any shadow of that toxic legacy hanging over her made me feel like we'd actually won something important. A letter arrived from a women's advocacy organization in early fall, asking if we'd be willing to share our story to help other families recognize patterns of gender-based violence. They explained that our case had made regional news during the trial, and several people had reached out to them saying they saw similarities in their own family situations. We talked it over with our therapist for a few sessions before deciding to do an anonymous interview. The organization published it on their website with all identifying details changed, but the core story intact about how family mythology can hide systematic violence against daughters. My husband legally changed our family surname to my maiden name the same month. He said he didn't want our daughters growing up with a name connected to so much violence and hatred toward women, and he wanted to honor my family instead of his. The paperwork took a few weeks to process, but eventually we all had new social security cards and updated documents with my family name. Our older daughter started kindergarten at the school near our new house that September. She made friends easily on the first day, and came home excited about her teacher and the playground and everything she'd learned. Watching her thrive in a normal, safe environment where nobody questioned her existence or her worth made me cry with relief that we'd actually broken the cycle and given our daughters a different future than the one my husband's family had planned. The 1-year mark since the conviction came and went without any big deal on our part. We spent that day having a picnic in our backyard, while both girls ran around playing tag and squealing with laughter. Our older daughter was 5.5 by then, and our younger one had just turned 18 months old and was toddling everywhere trying to keep up with her big sister. Watching them play together without any shadow of that horrible family history hanging over them made me feel like we'd actually won something real and lasting. My husband grilled burgers and we ate on a blanket spread out on the grass, while the girls picked dandelions and brought them to us like precious gifts. Nobody mentioned the anniversary out loud, but I caught my husband watching our daughters with this expression of fierce protectiveness, mixed with relief that we'd gotten them out of that situation before any real harm could touch them. A few weeks after that, my husband came home from work with news that his boss had called him into the office for what turned out to be a promotion announcement. He'd been given a senior position with a significant raise, and his boss told him the decision was based partly on his excellent work performance, but also on the tremendous character and leadership he'd shown while protecting his family through everything we'd been through. His boss apparently told him that watching him maintain his professional responsibilities while dealing with such a serious family crisis had impressed everyone in the department and shown the kind of person they wanted in leadership roles. My husband cried when he told me about it because he'd been so worried that the whole situation with his mother would damage his career or make people see him differently at work. The promotion meant we could finally start planning things we'd been putting off, like that beach vacation we'd been talking about for months. We booked a week at a rental house right on the ocean for next month, and both girls got so excited when we told them. Our older daughter started asking a million questions about what the beach would be like and whether she could build sand castles and collect seashells. Our younger daughter didn't fully understand yet, but she picked up on her sister's excitement and started clapping and bouncing around the living room. Planning that trip and thinking about making happy family memories that had nothing to do with my husband's toxic relatives felt like we'd finally built something good and solid from all the ashes of that horrible history. Our daughters were going to grow up knowing they were loved completely and celebrated exactly as they were without any shame or violence attached to being girls. And that's the story. I always try to make these moments something you can actually use in real life. If it helped you think or reflect, that's what matters most.